and welcome to MalMakes. Today I'm doing a video all about blending. So over on my Patreon, I asked everyone if I do another intro to painting video, is there an acrylic technique you'd like to see? And I listed like 10 of them that I use a lot of, like palette knife or sponging or like stippling. And overwhelmingly people asked for blending / like wet on wet acrylic. And I was like, that's great. So I thought about different things that really show off blending and how I blend my colors on canvases. And I do a lot of blending when I paint sky gradients or clouds or ocean. And I thought about what would work really well to show that off. And I thought, it's been a while since I've done an Animal Crossing painting. So I decided to paint Sunrise for Animal Crossing New Horizons, showing off different blending techniques. So I'm going to be talking about specialized tools that I use, or paint additives, or brush techniques, or things I use to help me blend things better when I'm trying to get things like smooth gradients and fluffy clouds and gradients in the water too. So what I want to do is I want to go over those things and really just kind of talk specifically about blending for this video as I'm painting this. To start with, I have 3 tips and 3 tools for you. My first 3 tips are to 1, have a plan. You need to know what you're doing ahead of time. Number 2, you need to have everything prepped. All your paint colors ready, mixed, ready to go, all the paintbrushes you could need. Everything is set, mise en place like you're cooking. You have everything ready. And the third thing is to work fast because you're combating acrylic's open time. Now, acrylic paint dries very fast, and the problem with blending and why some people prefer oils is it's hard to mix acrylic paint because it's actively drying on you as you're working on it. It's drying on your palette so you don't get as much paint to use, it's drying on your canvas so it won't blend, and it's drying on your paintbrush and starting to ruin your paintbrush. So you have to work fast and have things ready and have a plan and be all set to go, especially when you're trying to do something very smooth gradient blended like we're trying to do here. Now the 3 tools I have for you, the first one is they call this a wetting agent now, but it used to be called like acrylic flow release. I just put like 3 or 4 drops into my water container, and I've already done that here so you can't see because it's clear, but I just put a little bit of that in my water. So it's conditioning the water, and when I dip my brush into it before I start painting, a little tiny bit of that wetting agent gets into my brush, gets into my paints onto the canvas. It helps the paint spread a bit smoother. I don't want a ton of that mixed in, which is why it doesn't go directly into the paint. I just need a little bit. It also helps with pinpricks, so when your paint is very thick and it's not settling down into the texture and it's leaving little tiny pinpricks of where it hasn't gone into the canvas texture, this is something that helps with that as well. The other tool I have for you is something that affects the drying time of acrylic paint. So it makes it dry slower, and that's golden retarder. And like Liquitex has their own brand of this, and they might call it something else, I can't remember. But Golden's is golden retarder, and it makes things dry slower. So I kind of use this in combination with the flow release, and then the other thing I do is I use Golden Open for things that I really want to make sure stay wet and I can blend really well. Now I don't use all open paints because I don't like the consistency of them. They're a bit softer than like the regular heavy body. These are both titanium white and the 2 different types. So what I do is if I'm doing something like a sky or something I really need blended and I need it to stay wet and not dry out on me, I'll use just titanium white. Like I'll use my regular like primary yellow, but I'll use this alongside it because this will help this from drying out too fast. But it doesn't take absolutely forever if I was using all of these. So those are the 3 tips and the 3 tools I have. So now I'm going to put those in practice to do the sky. I have a plan. I'm going to paint titanium white into a light yellow, into green, into teal, into blue for my sky. And then I have to prep everything, so I'm going to get everything ready on my palette. I have my titanium white and open. I have some primary yellow, so I'm going to mix these to make my light yellow. I also have some primary cyan, so I can start to make my teal and then my green color. So I'm going to get all my colors ready. I have the wetting agent in my water. I'm going to put a few drops of this into the colors that dry out fast, like this yellow and the cyan. And then I'm going to work fast and put it all on the canvas for my sky. So I have my plan. My brush is a little bit damp with some of that water flow release wetting agent mix, and I have all of my colors prepped. And because these are open paints, they're a bit more slidey, so I can't tilt the palette a whole lot. I have titanium white, light yellow, yellow, and I start to get into some greens and teals, and then into the blue. So that's my plan to paint across the sky with, starting in the bottom right corner and going towards the top left. I have a little bit of violet on my palette just because I want to try and get some of the faraway clouds down here while everything is wet. So if I still have some time, and I'm pretty sure I will because I work pretty fast and all of these have all of the tips and tricks to make them stay wet longer, I'm going to take a little bit of this violet and bring in those wispy clouds along the horizon. When I'm doing these gradients, when I start with the white paint, I try to overpaint it. So I'm painting it a lot bigger than I need to because I'm going to blend it with the next color, not like drawing a harsh line. So I'm going to fill it really heavy here where it's supposed to be pure titanium white, and then brush it out softer out this way, because that's going to stay wet just enough time that when I get there with the color that goes there, it's going to blend into that and make the transition smoother. I also like to paint the sides of my canvases to wrap the image, so I'm also doing that as I work, just kind of trying to fill in the gradient that sits over there too. So I've put my first yellow down, and I do a little bit of a zigzag motion to try and bring parts of it into the next color over here, and then I just brush those smooth, just to make a nice blend there. Working my way out, doing the same thing with the yellow that I had done with the white, where I just do a light brushing out here so there's some yellow that fades that way that will mix in with my next color. So I'm taking a little bit of that violet paint and then just putting it down here to bring in some of these wispy clouds that are going to sit along the horizon. And I am putting more clouds in the sky, but those are going to have to wait until this dries. I'm liking how this looks a lot, so actually while the whole thing is wet, I'm just going to start to fill in clouds. Now I'm going to be using the same violet I have here, using lighter violets towards the sun itself and then darker violets out here. And I can also pick a little bit of some of the sky colors to bring in highlights on top as it's still wet and blend them together with my paintbrush. I'm also finding, because the background is still wet and I'm not liking the texture the brush leaves on it, like I don't like that. So I found that I can actually just use my fingertip a little bit and just blend this into the canvas because it's still wet, and it will soften that cloud. So that's what I'm doing to finish these up, and I'm going to keep going into this part of the sky. Over on the left side, I'm just using a few darker colors, like just a little bit more blue, just to make it a little bit darker on the far side of these clouds to give them just a little bit of depth. There's a few tricks you can use with the painter's tape to make sure you get the absolute sharpest line. And the thing I like to do is I use my fingernail to kind of scrub at the line I want to be sharp. So because I'm painting the ocean down here, I'm going to be peeling it up, and that's where my line is going, on the bottom part of the tape here. So I'm just using my fingernail to make sure it's really stuck. I've also heard using a little bit of water because it can help activate the glue. I don't find that works as well as this though. And the other thing people do is they'll paint like white over the top or gesso or their base color on top of this a little bit to help seal it in and then do their painting. So that kind of makes another extra little barrier there. Sometimes people use like whatever color is under the tape. That can also help make that little bit of a barrier, but most of the time I just use my fingernail and really make sure I push it down onto the canvas. So I have my plan. I've drawn it roughly here on my canvas. So I know about where the rocks are gonna go, about where the beach is going, where the water's going, where some of the waves are, where the dark coral under the water is. And that's my plan. And I have everything prepped here on my palette. I have a light blue for the lightest parts of some of the highlights, into a medium and then a dark, and then this is for the coral down here in the corner because that sits a lot darker. And I've covered that up because I might do that as a wash to kind of blend it in visually. I might not, so I just wanted to protect it so it doesn't dry out on me. I'm also going to use that for a fish shadow whenever I figure out exactly where the fish is going to go in the water. So I'm making sure I save that paint so I still have that same color later. Now this will not be the entirety of the ocean. This is just going to be the base layer. I want to make sure I have this all blended and nice where it transitions between all my colors here on the canvas. So I'm still working wet in wet paint on the canvas while everything is still wet and open and blendable. Later after it dries, I'll bring in a few sparkles for the highlights, some of the foam here on the beach for the waves, and that part needs to go on dry and doesn't really blend in because I can't have an entirely soft painting. That's not 100% of the look I go for when I paint, so some of it has to dry so I can get some of those harsher edges. I'm also finding the lightest color I mixed up was not light enough, so I can just take a little bit of this open titanium white on my paintbrush. It will blend in here on the brush and also blend on the canvas and just lighten that part up for me. Now I have a really good base layer for the ocean. I'm happy with it, I'm happy with the colors blending, but I do want to change some things up a little bit. And now that this is dry, I can do more of a visual mixing instead of a physical mixing or blending. So this was all done physically on the canvas, wet on wet. And now that it's dry, I can mix some gloss glazing liquid into the colors I want, put them on top, and they will just kind of blend in visually. Like it just looks like they're blending when they're not because the clear is going to function as the other color, but still let the color underneath show through. So for example, I want it to be lighter over here where the sun is going to be. Now I'm going to add a lot of detail there later for the detail stage of the water, but I do want to lighten it up in some of these areas. I want to bring some of the lighter colors into this a little bit more. You can kind of see where I've drawn it in chalk. I want to darken up these rocks under the water. So I'm going to be using the gloss glazing liquid with that lighter color to fill in some of this. So it's going to visually mix on the canvas. I added a fish silhouette in, and I'm really happy with that choice because it just makes it match more and feel more appropriate. So I put that in using the same color as I have for these rocks here, and then just took some of my lighter colors with the glazing liquid and went over the top of it just to push it under the water so it didn't look like it was floating. That way it's sitting underneath something so it looks like it's under the water. Next, I want to put the sand in, so I'm going to mix up a base sand color and a wet sand color. Then I will paint them in, and while they're both wet, I can kind of blur the edge where they should be so it fades from one to the other. Now, I don't want to have a super smooth gradient like I have for my sky. I still want there to kind of be a line there, but I don't want it to be a very sharp line like the edges of the fish or the tops of these rocks. Next up, I want to work on the rocks. Now there's still some work to do on the water with foam and reflections and such, but I'm working on these first because I want to make sure I have this edge done before I finish up the water part and the sand part. So I'm doing the rocks with blending. Now this is a visual blending. They're not actually blended like this gradient or any of this stuff where I was doing it wet and wet. I'm starting with a dark color to fill in all of the cool shadows. This is the parts of the rock that are going to be the darkest in shadow. So I like to do that first because I can start to build it into the lighter parts from there, and I can start to see where things are going to go. Now this is just a base layer, so I have the shapes and the general color of things. After it's dry, I'm going to start putting other things on top to make it look more like rock texture and start to make it look more three-dimensional here on the canvas. So it's visually blending to your eye. Like you think it's blended, but it's not. So I'm just starting with this base layer, and then I'll put the other stuff on top later. So the shapes I have, I like, and I like the colors I have, except for some of this like not as bright highlight I have here on some of these areas. Like it's okay here and here and here, but I don't like it in these other areas. So I'm going to cover that up with some of my lighter violet color, and then I'm going to start doing the visual mixing. So visual mixing is kind of like pointillism or some other things that work similar, where I have things next to each other, and close up you can see those brush swipes. But when you step back, they mix, and then your brain sees it as rock texture or whatever it's supposed to be. So once I have this covered up, I'm going to take a darker color here, darker than this one, and start to bring some texture on some of those areas. And then I'll take the color that's here now and start to bring that in on the next darkest area and keep building it until I have more of a stone texture on the rock. Using this technique with the rocks, I find that I lose my darkest colors because I've started with those and then I've built everything else on top. So I start to lose them because they're getting covered up. So I started with black and moved into some of these deep purples, into lighter purple, and then into the warm highlights from where the sun is hitting the rock. and I've lost that dark Mars black I had for the deepest parts of the shadow. So all I had to do once I was done was just add a little bit more Mars black in some areas to bring back some of those deep recesses in the rock face and that definition to make it look like it actually has some of those areas in it. But now that that's done, I only have 3 things left to do. The first thing is I'm going to add a little bit of shadow here on the sand so the rock has something to sit on. So I'm taking the wet sand color I've mixed up with a little bit of glazing liquid and just putting a little bit of a shadow down here so it has that weight to it on the sand. And I'm using the glazing liquid just to blend it out as I get out here to the sand that's going to be in the sun. It's incredible what just a little bit of white paint is doing right here. Now I'm doing a technique called dry brushing where there's not a whole lot of paint on the brush and I'm not trying to fill anything in solid. I'm just trying to give a little bit of color on some areas. In a way, it's kind of like putting on like blush or like some makeup where you don't want like a big, bright, like red circle. You just kind of want it soft on top of the skin and seeing it through. So there's not a whole lot of paint on this brush and I'm just kind of brushing it out and trying to fade it a little bit, but still giving some indication that there's like the foam that's sitting there on top of this water. So I'm just filling in some more white here and I finished these highlights and that turned out really well. So once I'm happy with how the foam looks in this space, it's all done. And we're done. We have an Animal Crossing sunrise scene all about blending. If you're interested in this piece, you could buy a poster or a phone case, or bid on this original canvas. There's links down below. Also, consider supporting me on Patreon. You can find out more at supportmal.com. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes of MalMakes, and I'll see you again here for another video game painting.